It's time for Global Insight. The world's population growth is slowing down as fertility rates drop in many countries, and the number of people in the world set to peak before the end of the century. South Korea has the lowest birth rate among OECD countries and saw the newborn count drop to a record low last year, with concerns growing over future productivity and fiscal soundness going forward. We discuss what needs to be done to prepare for the demographic changes taking place and the ramifications that lie ahead. For this, we are joined by Professor Sangmi of Ewha School of Business and Professor Peter McDonald from University of Melbourne today. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Now, Professor McDonald, let's begin with you. Let us start with you by asking the question on the UN's recent annual report on global population showed the number of people in the world grew at the slowest pace last year in over 7 decades. What led to the severe shrinkage last year?
Well, the world's fertility rate has been falling for a long time, for 50 years, and it's picking up pace as well, falling even faster. So today there's about 100 countries in the world that have fertility rates that are below the level that replaces the population, about 2 children per woman. And that includes the 3 largest countries, and China, India, and the United States. And China in particular contributes to the very recent fall in global population growth rates, because its fertility has fallen to quite a low level in a few years. And East Asian populations are the world champions of very low fertility rates. And in most East Asian countries, the fertility rate is under 1.3, well and truly below the level that replaces the population. And just taking Korea as an example, if you go back to 1970, Korea's fertility rate was around 5 children per woman, and now it's less than 1 child per woman. So that has a huge impact. Also, the world's population. If the world's fertility rate had remained the same for the last 50 years as it was in 1970, the world's population today would be about 15 billion, almost twice what it actually is. So the decline in fertility in that 50 years has had a huge impact.
Right. Now, you've briefly touched upon South Korea, so let's turn to Professor Che. Professor, we thought South Korea's birth rate was as low as it could get, but over the past year, it outdid itself by falling to 0.81 child per woman. The Bank of Korea says this may have been due to the pandemic. Do you agree? What has been the impact of the global health crisis on the population?
Actually, I agree that the global pandemic has clearly had an impact on declining fertility. Of course, the pandemic isn't only a factor driving the decline of fertility. However, it is a major factor that has contributed to the rapid decline in the fertility rate in the past 2 years. If you're looking at the fertility rate in other countries as well as Korea over past 2 years, for example, in the case of United States, fertility rate fell by about 7% during the pandemic. If women in their 30s who delay giving birth during the pandemic may be at the increased risk of infertility, also, it is clear that women in their 20s will have a longer term effect, not just for 2 years, because if employments and graduation are delayed during the pandemic, the number of children they can have during their lifetime will decrease. So as a result, the pandemic has an impact on the world fertility rate, and I believe that this effect could be seen in the longer term.
Right. Now, Professor McDonald, what has been the impact for the global health crisis for the global population growth? Which specific demographics were hit especially hard?
Well, of course, there was higher mortality rates, particularly at the older ages in a lot of countries, and expectation of life fell, not a huge amount, but fell in several countries. On the fertility, well, there was marginal impacts on fertility rates as births were delayed. But when it comes to low fertility, we don't need to be pointing at the pandemic, because Korea's fertility has been very low for a long time, way before the pandemic. And the underlying causes of very low fertility are much more much more fundamentally social and economic, the nature of society. They're not, the pandemic is a bit of a side issue, I think.
Right. So pandemic is a bit of side issues. So
I must say that in some countries that have high migration rates, like Australia, the pandemic had a huge impact on that. There was big out-migration from Australia during the pandemic rather than a big in-migration. So that was a big impact.
Right. So let's talk about something more fundamental then. Professor Che, perception of marriage and having a family have changed with an increasing number of young Koreans saying they're prepared to forego getting married. Is this because they can't or won't get married, or both?
If you look at the current survey to 20s, 40s, the carried out last year, as for the reason for the increase in non-marriage and men, decided the burden of childbirth and child rearing the most, which is more than 30%, and followed by excessive housing cost, which is more than 25%. And if you look at the woman's side, women said that they value personal life and leisure the most, which is more than 55%, 25%, followed by excessive housing expenses, which is more than 20%, and the burden of childbirth and child rearing, which is 20%. So there was a little bit difference in views between men and women about the marriage, but it was found that both men and women felt the burden of housing costs and childbirth and rearing in common. So based on this survey result, we can conclude that more than 50% of young Koreans have enough reason they can get married.
Right, so they can get married. And in fact, South Korea is also trying to help that. Because each family is entitled to 300,000 won per month until a child is 2 years old. The government on Tuesday announced that it would offer 700,000 won or $520 a month until a child turns 1 and increase the rate to 1 million won the following year. Are measures such as this enough to reverse the current childbirth? I know you've touched upon how their ability, but there's even stronger help.
According to other survey, conducted nationwide last year, as a result of asking about the effectiveness of childbirth subsidies and raising the fertility rate, around 59% answered it's not helpful. Also, they showed opinions that the payments of child care allowance was also not helpful, which is, 59% respondents answers like that. So actually, that money allowance is not helpful to raising the fertility rate, basically in the perception of young generation. However, in the same survey, more than 45% of respondents actually answered establishment and expansion of a maternity leave system as the policy that should be urgently pursued for this purpose. So this result emphasized that it is time to prepare a system for a good environment to raise children in the conjunction with the child care policy, employment policy, and welfare policy to change the perception of future generation.
Right. Now, Professor McDonald, shifting gears to you, the UN projects over half of the estimated increase in the world's population will be concentrated in 8 countries, most of them in Southeast Asia and Africa. What major shifts do you expect will take place across the global economy as a result?
Well, it's South Asia, not Southeast Asia.
Sorry.
India and Pakistan, those countries. India's fertility rate is low, but because it still has a young age structure, even the lower fertility rate will still produce quite a lot of people into the future. But the big population growth will be in West and Central African countries. These are today relatively poor countries where skill levels, education levels are still relatively low, but rapidly improving. So that's where the growth is. In other countries, you're going to have, like Korea, in 20 years. At the moment, for Korea, a small number of children is an economic benefit because you don't have to pay for the children. But in 20 years' time or so, it will start to have a huge impact on the labour supply. And the labour force in Korea will start to fall very, very, very rapidly. And that situation applies in a lot of other countries as well, like China and Japan. In Japan, it's already well underway. So there's, in one part of the world, you'll have excess labour, in the other part of the world, a big shortage of labour. So you can expect to see, I think, investment flowing to the places where the labour exists, and China already is investing heavily in Africa. But it's a question of skill levels. You know, skill levels are still relatively low in the poorer countries, and so it's not a perfect outcome. Some countries, which are the migrant-receiving countries, countries like Canada and Australia, are able to overcome very low fertility through migration, and quite relatively large-scale migration. But if we talk about Korea and Korea's really low fertility rate, to compensate just through migration would require close to 500,000 migrants coming into Korea every year for the rest of time. And so, you know, Korea, that's not a solution that's going to work, because in the, you know, not too distant future, in over 80, 100 years, most of the population would be the migrants, not Koreans. So that, you know, for Korea, it's really essential, really quite essential that they look for ways to increase the fertility rate.
Right. Now, Professor McDonald has touched upon South Korea briefly, but Professor Che, we've heard for many years that South Korea is facing demographic crisis, which will threaten its productivity, as Professor McDonald has already touched. But we're already seeing some schools close as student numbers dwindle. When and how will South Korea, like Professor McDonald has previewed, start feeling the impact directly of its declining population in its economy?
Actually, economic growth will be affected as number of birth, you know, so which is decrease, and working also based on the birth decrease, the working age, working age population age 15 to 64 who can engage in economic activity decrease as well. So according to the future population estimation of the National Statistical Office, the working age population in Korea will start to decline after peaking in 2018, and is expected to reach 33.95 million by 2030, which is, you know, almost 90% of the 2020 level. So we are in the decreasing point right now. And for economic growth, you know, input factors, production such as labor, capital, and technology must increase. But if the labor supply decreases, the working age population decreases, the foundation for economic growth may be weakened. So in terms of demands, you know, vitality of the national economy may be decreased as the total population decreases, and the domestic demands also will be obviously shrink. So that's why, you know, now we are also experiencing that declining effect that it's going to be more harder in 2030. 2030, based on a statistical, you know, report.
Right. And now I want to shed light on another aspect to this issue. Professor McDonald, how should governments prepare social spending for their elderly populations?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. If the national transfer accounts show that expenditure, both public and private, on older people per capita is relatively low in Korea compared to, say, the Western countries and Japan in particular. And so if conditions for older people are going to be improving in Korea, then expenditure on older people is actually going to have to go up from what it is now. And that will obviously be a challenge in the face of declining labour supply. And, you know, it's important to remember that as the population falls, the fall in population is at the younger ages. At the same time, the older ages continue to grow for quite some time. And so population aging then becomes a major issue. You need to look for efficient ways of delivering health and delivering care in older age. Looking at, for a lot of countries, increases in labour force participation rates of older persons, but Korea's labour force participation rates at older ages are already quite high from an OECD standard, so not much scope there.
Right. Now, we only have time for one more question, Professor Che, but before we go, we wanted to ask, what are the long-term measures that are needed to make young people feel secure enough to get married and raise children?
I think there is a need to reduce the cost of marriage and childbirth on a national level. From an economic point of view, it is necessary to establish a social system that can reduce not only the cost of childbirth and marriage, but also the cost of individual time and effort. So to this end, continuous efforts are needed to lower the psychological barrier to enter into marriage and the childbirth, through the stabilization of the real estate price and various support measures for childcare after childbirth, so that young people can believe that they can improve economically and socially after marriage and childbirth.
Well, I'm afraid this is all the time we have for today. That was Professor Sangmi Che of Ewha School of Business and Professor Peter McDonald from University of Melbourne. Thank you for your time. We hope to speak to you both again soon.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.